the Mishcon Academy digital sessions.
Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining this Mishcon Academy session today. I'm Katy Colton. I'm the head of our Politics and Law group here at Mishcon Diaries, and I'll be hosting today's event. Now, before I introduce today's guest, I just want to run through a few housekeeping tips, more guidance rather than law. For those on Zoom, you've joined automatically on mute and without video. Now, we're not using the Q&A function today because questions were submitted in advance, but if you have any technical issues, please just pop a question in the chat function and one of the Mishcon team will help you out. And just want to give a sense of the room for those who have joined us online. The room is absolutely jam-packed. I think we've never had a turnout quite like it. So I think there's huge interest in today's event. So with housekeeping out of the way, I'm pleased to introduce today's guest, Matt Hancock, MP. As I'm sure many of you know, Matt was elected as the MP for West Suffolk in 2010. He served as a minister under 3 prime ministers, most notably as the Minister for Health and Social Care, first under Theresa May and then lastly under Boris Johnson during the COVID pandemic. More recently, Matt came third on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, and during his stint in the jungle, he described a technique known as the pivot, which was a way of avoiding difficult questions, so we'll be looking out for that today.
I've completely skewered my ability to pivot
have.
For the rest of the day.
Absolutely have. Matt joins us today to discuss his book, Pandemic Diaries, which he describes as the inside story of Britain's fight against COVID. The book includes a number of memorable anecdotes, including Boris Johnson wanting to get his dog tested for COVID antibodies, which Chris Whitty, I think, quickly talked him out of that. As I say, there's been huge interest in today's talk because everyone was affected in some way by the pandemic and many continue to be so. So I'll be discussing with Matt today the government's handling of COVID, and we'll also touch on broader issues including the NHS at the moment and the future of the NHS, issues to do with rule of law and the executive power. We'll then be turning to questions at the end, but these are questions that have been submitted in advance. So thank you so much, Matt, for joining us. I want to start with the book and the process for writing the book.
Yeah.
So the clue is in the title of the book. It's written as a diary, but on the first page you say you didn't keep a diary at the time. You say you were so busy that on some days you had to have toilet breaks scheduled into your timetable, and so there was no time really to keep a diary. And that you've worked with a journalist after the event to piece together what you were thinking at the time, from voice notes, from text messages, government papers. How do you counter criticism that what is said that you were thinking at the time is pregnant with hindsight?
Well, it's a totally reasonable question, and it's one we addressed as I was writing the book. And what I've tried to do is go to primary sources from the time, but I also wanted to be completely honest that it is a piecing together of primary sources. So in a way, it's my own attempt at the history of what I was going through as I experienced it. And in that sense, there's much of that primary source comes from the communications that we had, WhatsApps primarily, email, but also notes and voice notes that I wrote, but I didn't write them as a linear diary. I wrote them as aid memoirs, if you like. So it's totally reasonable to read it and say with a skeptical eye, but I thought that it was important to write it, to get it down. The main motivation for writing it is that I felt very acutely when I was in the hot seat that there wasn't a guide, and I didn't have the benefit of being able to see what had happened before and how people had taken decisions before. And that is really unusual when you're taking big decisions. There's nearly always a precedent. And in this case, there was precedent from history, but really quite old history. There was precedent from international experience, MERS and SARS in particular, and Ebola to a lesser extent, just because the disease is very different. And then, as I describe in the book, from fiction as well. You know, I talk. People laughed at me when I said that I watched Contagion, the movie, but Contagion was written with epidemiologists to try to imagine in advance what a major pandemic would look and feel like, and so it was one of the best the best guides to things that would happen in the future, because people had sat down and thought what might happen were there to be a pandemic in a very creative way. So essentially, my answer to your question is hands up. I'm completely straightforward and honest about that. What I'm trying to do is get down the experience as accurately as I could of what it was like. And this I see as a complement to the inquiry, which will go through what is in effect the line-by-line objective analysis. This is about how I felt about the reality of taking decisions at the speed that we were, as opposed to the dry policy formulation element, which the inquiry will undoubtedly capture, but doesn't really capture the experience of being in that hot seat.
And on that point, in terms of setting precedent and having a guide for people to follow, right, I think it's interesting. Your immediate predecessor, Jeremy Hunt, obviously now the Chancellor, he admittedly had a much quieter COVID than you did. And he spent that time writing his book Zero, which is a manifesto for how to deal with the NHS and change and reduce excessive deaths. So I'm interested in why you chose the diary format rather than, say, writing a whole book on lessons learned.
Yeah, so my initial instinct was to write a book about lessons learned. And my favourite chapter in the book is the epilogue, which is a lessons learned with hindsight chapter. And the reason that I didn't is simply the scale of the material. So in trying to organise it by sort of subject matter, the testing chapter, the vaccine chapter, the lockdown chapter, I found that there was so much material, I couldn't condense it into a readable format doing it that way. The inquiry, it's up to the chair, but I would expect the inquiry to do it that way.
Yeah.
And to say, okay, the testing programme, right? What did we get right? What did we get wrong? How can we do it better? What do we need to do now to be better ready? And go through it in a structured that way. It was sheer quantity of material. I mean, I aimed to write a 250-page book and wrote a nearly 600-page book.
It is quite long, yes.
But
there's lots to cover.
I cut out so much. Yeah, and I kept the best anecdotes in, obviously, like the one about Dylan. But and I wanted to make it to write a readable book as well. So the answer to the question really of that judgment of to do it in diary format pieced together was about tractability. Yeah,
and I take that point. I think one example of lots and lots of things to discuss is the issue of care homes.
Yeah.
And obviously, as you would expect, it pops up throughout the book. As your junior minister is asking you, what should we do about care homes?
Yeah.
I think, as from a lawyer's perspective, and particularly a specialist in public law, we're really interested in outcomes of judicial reviews.
Yeah.
And in April 2022, the High Court ruled that the policy documents that your department early in the pandemic were unlawful because they failed to take into account the risk to elderly and vulnerable residents from non-symptomatic transmission.
Yeah.
Do you accept the criticism of the High Court?
Of course I accept the judgment, and the department decided not to appeal it. I think that judicial review is a very odd tool to use in these circumstances because there was no rectification, there was no consequence of that action, and in fact the finding that asymptomatic transmission wasn't considered was, in my view, inaccurate because I considered it. What it actually found is that asymptomatic transmission was not presented in the formal policy papers to me as an assumption or a significant risk. But we'd been talking about it since January. Now, the oddity on judicial review in these circumstances where the Secretary of State has left the department is firstly that I wasn't involved in that court action at all. If I'd been called as a witness and asked, did you consider asymptomatic transmission, I would have said, yes, of course I did. We'd been debating it for months, whether it happened or not. But because the official scientific consensus was that there couldn't be asymptomatic transmission of a coronavirus because there hadn't been previously, that's what formally came in through the PhD advice, which came in the formal papers to me. But that isn't to say that I didn't consider other things as well and other considerations, like the fact that several months earlier there'd been evidence of asymptomatic transmission in Germany. Now, with hindsight, my mistake was not to insist that we base our policy on a worst case scenario of significant asymptomatic transmission. But there's only so many times you can overrule the scientific advice, and I wish I had on that occasion, on that subject. And I didn't. But there's another point about judicial review which is important in this case, because these judicial reviews were not really brought about to enlighten anybody. They were brought about, in my view, for an entirely presentational political campaign by the GLP, which has since thankfully run into the dust. And it really undermined the use of the legal process, in my view. And there's one particular tweak which annoys me, which I've written in the book, which is that a judicial review is taken out against the named person of the Secretary of State, but actually it's a judicial review against the department. And the other judicial review that we lost on doing the paperwork on PPE contracts, which was about a year earlier, that was also, I didn't have anything to do with it. It was, did the officials file the paperwork on time? Answer, no, they were on average a fortnight late. Was that the correct decision by the officials? Absolutely, because they were saving lives rather than doing the paperwork. Did I have anything to do with it? Nothing at all. And so, but of course, as the Secretary of State, you are the legal personality.
Yes.
And so I understand all of that, but I personally think that judicial review should be amended to formally take departments to court, but they can't because the government
have no legal personality.
Because departments have no legal personality. So therefore, they should take HMG to court rather than the individual of the Secretary of State, simply because I don't think it's an appropriate use of the courts to essentially go chasing tabloid headlines saying, Hancock broke the law. I didn't break the law.
But do you think that is what the court's doing? I mean, it's clear importance. It's a key element of our constitution that we have clear separation of powers, and that the judiciary holds the executive to account.
Yes, absolutely. And I think judicial review is important, and especially where there is the necessity for a change because of the consequence of a judicial review. Pure hindsight, especially where it's structured that the charge is brought to generate headlines rather than substance, I think is a waste of time, and GLP have since failed to be able to find grounds for further cases. I mean, and partly, one of the reasons I feel as strongly as I do about this is partly because it's sort of asymptomatic. It's an asymmetric contest, because the department and therefore the legal personality of the Secretary of State won on almost everything against the GLP. We lost on 2, and here we are talking about it. I mean, the GLP, in my view, have brought the law and the process of the law into disrepute. And for somebody who believes very strongly in the rule of law, like I do, I think it'd be far better for everybody, for us, and frankly, for all of you, when they pack up and go home.
So I'll put another judicial review to you. So the judicial review, Gina Miller, the second Gina Miller judicial review, which this firm acted on in relation to prorogation. So when you were standing for the leadership against, when Boris Johnson was made
I was
leader,
very strongly against prorogation.
Strongly against prorogation, but then you supported prorogation.
Well, I kind of just tried to keep my head down. So I was running the NHS, and I thought my job was to run the NHS, and I ducked as much as possible. I decided, this is on Brexit, so pre-pandemic, I decided I wasn't going to resign over the issue of prorogation, so the best thing was to say as little about it as possible. I thought that it was a mistake in the end, it was not only counterproductive. It wasn't only the wrong approach. It was actually counterproductive because in that battle at that time, it galvanised the opponents, the supporters of the so-called Benn Act. So I made sometimes in government, you make an argument and you lose that argument, and that was one. I made the argument. I describe in the book how I happened to have lunch with Dominic Cummings the day before the news leaked. I asked him if they were going to use prorogation. He straightforwardly said no to me, and then the next day it leaked that they were doing it. And he knew how strongly I felt about it, and I clocked Cummings at that point. I was wow. Because in politics, there's an awful lot, as you all know as lawyers, there's an awful lot of use of language in order to put your point across, should I say, in the most beneficial way possible. There is very, very, very few examples of actual barefaced lies in politics. That is not how politics works. It's just like the law, right? And I can see people nodding. They use the language very carefully and precisely to get your point across. You wouldn't, as a lawyer, you would not lie, right? Professionally, it's totally against the code of ethics, but it's also really impractical because as soon as you've done it once, it blows up your credibility, right? It's exactly the same in politics. Personally, I think that more straightforwardness would be better in politics, but actually having somebody tell you a barefaced lie is very rare and was really shocking to me.
Well, you don't hide your views of Dominic Cummings in the book. You describe him as such a frightening, damaging, negative force. So I think that's quite clear.
That's understated.
So, turning to our theme, the next issue that you raised that had also been challenged by judicial review is the procurement of PPE.
Yeah.
And I think what's clear from the page of the book is that you feel angry. You describe yourself as incandescent about what I would say the dominant narrative about PPE procurement. You describe Meg Hillier, the chair of the Public Accounts Committee, which you were formerly a member of.
With her
as acting in a pitifully low manner in her descriptions of contracts for cronies.
Yeah.
So do you think it's right that questions are being asked about PPE procurement?
I think that the narrative being peddled by some is completely wrong, and I find it offensive. And I find it offensive as opposed to just wrong for this reason. That when the nation was in crisis and we desperately needed PPE to save lives, a huge number of people stepped forward and tried to help. And we basically did everything we could to get as much PPE into the country as possible in a moment of crisis. And then afterwards, for Meg and the Public Accounts Committee, in a highly politicised way, to criticise some but not others, not other parts of that process, was completely wrong. So, and it's become politicised and partisan. But at the time, Rachel Reeves, who I know well, was writing to Michael Gove saying, here's a load of potential leads on PPE, and then asking questions, why are you not following these leads up? And we put those leads through exactly the same process as any other credible leads that we got. I think there's a lot of hindsightery in this that people say, but why couldn't you have done this perfectly? Well, the answer was because there was a global shortage of PPE and we needed to source it from around the world. And the JR is a case in point, in that my officials were completely right to make the decisions that they did to prioritise purchasing over paperwork, and the reason that I have an emotional response to it is a sense of injustice for those, including me, but not just me, who worked incredibly hard to try to save as many lives as possible, and then got criticised by people who were not involved and didn't know what it was like.
I understand that there was a huge crisis, and you describe quite well in the book about the international scramble for PPE.
Yeah.
Every country was trying to get PPE.
Yeah.
And that you say in those circumstances you couldn't have done it perfectly, which I think is entirely reasonable.
Yeah.
But I just want to put a few figures to you, and you may not accept these figures, and that'll be interesting itself. But the Public Accounts Committee has estimated that of the £12 billion spent on PPE, the department's written off £8.7 billion of that value, including £4 billion on PPE, which did not meet NHS standards. And as a comparator, the entire budget for the Ministry of Justice in 21-22 was £9.4 billion.
Yeah.
So I understand it couldn't be done perfectly, but when I put those figures to you, should it be that a government in times of crisis has carte blanche just to get on with things in any way possible? Or do you wish that things had been done slightly differently to reduce the amount of waste, both from a monetary perspective and also just a sheer volume of PPE that is sitting in warehouses that you now have to pay for storage costs or to get rid of it?
Well, of course, PPE sitting in warehouses that can be easily used is a very important thing for the country to have. And so to be criticised for having a big store of PPE is something, it's a criticism I wish we had to withstand in January 2020. So criticise me all you like for having too much PPE. I'd rather save lives. On the numbers side, of course, what those figures don't take into account is the fact that the market moved. So a lot of the losses on PPE is because the market for PPE moved very aggressively against us, i.e. prices went up, and then after the crisis passed, the prices came down. But we didn't know how long the crisis was going to be and how much PPE we were going to need. We knew the run rate, but we didn't know how long it would last for. So it is totally reasonable, yes, to over-purchase PPE. And the thing that I find odd about this is that I get criticised for both underbuying and overbuying PPE. So that probably makes me feel like we got it about right.
Okay, so you think you got it about right?
Well, I would say that it's impossible to land this one on the pin. Right, it's impossible to buy exactly the right amount of PPE for a crisis that you don't know how much PPE is going to be used and you don't know how long it's going to last for. So it's perfectly reasonable to say you bought too much. It's perfectly reasonable to say that you bought too little, but it's not reasonable to say both. And it's also very reasonable to have a debate about how much we should have bought. But what really matters is how much we should have in storage. The one obvious lesson is we should make sure that you can then get it out rapidly, because that was a massive screw up. So that's about it being pickable. But the Public Accounts Committee figures that you report were what I regard as tabloid figures as opposed to substantive ones.
So so it's about both quantity and quality, though?
Yeah, and then buying PPE that wasn't usable. We had two problems. One was a load of the PPE in the store turned out to be not usable, that was a relatively small amount. The bigger quantity was PPE in the store that had best before dates on that weren't in fact valid, and then we had this terrible head scratching moment of, okay, so the scientists say that this PPE is usable, but it's got a date that it's past its best before by date. How are we going to persuade people to put on a mask where the best before by date on it says that it is no longer usable, but our experts in the area say that it is? So, but that is, I mean, what do you do in those circumstances? The answer is you do the best you can with the resources that you've got in front of you.
Absolutely. So in terms of anecdotes, I think a notable one comes from April 2020, and I think it touches on the point you just said, where you think you've got it about right on PPE. So in the daily press briefing, we all remember those. We didn't really have much else to do.
Oh, you're doing Turkey?
I'm not doing Turkey, but shall we?
Yeah.
In the daily press briefing, you were asked what you got wrong. And in the moment, you say you panicked, and your answer was, we could have brought in the economic passage a bit quicker. And as a result, you had to apologise to Rishi Sunak. You bought him a bottle of champagne.
I bought him a case of wine, actually.
Case of wine?
Yeah, I didn't know he was a teetotaler. It was very embarrassing. I took it round to him, ostentatiously. I didn't have to apologise. I chose to apologise to him. I shouldn't have reached for a mistake that was outside my own domain, but I was trying to answer a question in a way that wouldn't then lead to a massive explosion in the Daily Mail and all that sort of thing. And so I said a truthful answer, which is that we could have brought them in a little bit faster. Actually, it didn't blow up into a major thing, but I still felt that I should have given an answer for something I was personally accountable for. So I went to apologise. I took a case of wine into the office in number 11, the Chancellor's office, and he came out of the sort of inner room, and he said, I said, "This is for you. I'm really sorry. I screwed up on a question and landed you in it." And he said, "Oh, you didn't have to do that. Anyway, my dad will really enjoy it." And I said, oh, your dad will enjoy it. He said, I'm teetotal. And honestly, I thought, how did I not know that? And how embarrassing it was. And then I thought how brilliant an answer my dad will enjoy it was, because it was incredibly gracious to accept it and not to try to embarrass me even further when I was already feeling pretty sheepish about it.
So if you were asked that question now, what would your answer be?
Okay, so this is really important, and basically what I hope the inquiry gets to the bottom of. So here's a few things that we need to have better for the future. The number one is we need a vaccine program that can deliver a vaccine against a new disease in 100 days. We did it in just over 300 days, but we need that to be delivered in 100 days, because it's quite clear that a vaccine is the only way out of these things. Once you can't get herd immunity without an unacceptably large level of impact on the population. So we need a vaccine program that's faster. Second, we need a testing program that can expand very quickly. Your testing program in sort of pandemic peacetime is never going to be as big as it needs to be in a pandemic, but you need to be able to get it bigger faster. Third, we need to really look through all of the lockdown rules to try to make lockdown as undamaging as possible for the reduction in social interaction. So an example of where we improved this during the pandemic was exercise, where second time round we had much more liberal rules on exercise because it's so important. We got that, and funerals, another one where we got the rules wrong first time round. There's the next critical thing I'd point to is the operation of care homes. Now, there's a story I didn't put in the book, which was about actually banning people from working in more than one care home. Yep. And here I feel very strongly about the lessons learned. Of course, it would be better to test people going from hospital into care homes, and the tests weren't available at the time, and we put in place rules for isolating people in care homes in case they had COVID. However, the scientific research has shown that the vast majority of infections that got into care homes got in from the community, because staff live in the community and work in care homes. It's not the staff's fault. It's just a fact of life. And at the time, we were worried about something that in the end didn't happen, but did happen elsewhere. For instance, in Spain, where staff went home from care homes and people died from neglect rather than from COVID. Thankfully, that didn't happen, but we were worried about, you've got to remember the dogs that don't bark, as I describe it as in the epilogue. And so the story that I didn't get round to telling in the book was my struggle with the system to actually ban people from working in more than one care home during the pandemic. In the end, we recommended against it, and we reduced the incidence of people moving from one care home to another by about 90%. So in the second wave, care homes were much better protected. So there's obviously improvements around the management of care homes. Do you want me to carry on? I mean, there's loads.
I think these are really interesting lessons learned, but the question that was asked in the press briefing was, what have you got wrong? And personally, are there things that you think you got wrong or would have done differently?
Oh, definitely. Well, right, the rules around funerals, the rules around exercise in the first pandemic, allowing people to exercise more. Obviously, the implement on asymptomatic transmission, which I've already talked about. I would have taken in-house the growth of the testing program earlier instead of waiting till mid-March, because it was clear. I was already frustrated by that at the end of the performance of PHE on that at the end of January, and it took to March the 17th for me to take command of that program, and then it expanded, but we could have gone faster on that. There's loads of things.
Well, it was a long period of time that you were in charge of, and unprecedented times.
Yeah, so and the unprecedented scale of decisions. Here's one that people don't really talk about. We had a long debate in the first lockdown about whether to stop construction, And in the balance of the impact on the economy and the impact on R, as in the spread of the virus, the R number, if you remember that. We're all epidemiologists now. Construction it has a massive economic impact if you close it, but not that big an impact on R because it's mostly people working outdoors. And so we decided not to close construction. And opposite my office in the Department for Health on Victoria Street, there was a huge construction site. And Rishi and I had this big debate about it, and in the end, I made the concession and said, "Okay, I'm happy for construction to stay open," which he had been arguing strongly for. The next day, I turn up at the office. I go up to my room overlooking this construction site on the 9th floor. Nothing happening. Everybody had gone home, and so we had put out rules saying it's okay for basically everybody needs to stay at home except a few key workers, and construction was one of them. And we obviously had completely failed to communicate that because all the construction workers had gone home.
I think that's interesting. It turns to my next topic, which is on leadership and governance and the way that message is communicated. I think the book really does give a fascinating insight into the way decisions were made at the top and the eye of the store.
Yeah.
And I must admit that at times it did appear to be rather dysfunctional. I'll just give a few examples. So Boris Johnson appears to be entirely absent at the beginning. When you give him the worst case scenario of 820,000 deaths, he seems his response is shrug. You don't hide your opinion of Dominic Cummings, as we discussed. There's multiple allegations of stories being leaked to the press by different parties.
Absolutely awful.
At one point, Boris Johnson asked you to bring your phone in to see whether you were the source of one of the leaks.
Yeah.
There are rivals.
I wasn't, by the way.
There are rivals uninviting each other from different meetings.
Yeah.
For instance, you weren't invited to a high-level meeting with the Prime Minister on coming out of lockdown in June 2020. And you say in the book that managing number 10 is a massive and extremely frustrating part of my job.
Yeah.
Would you say that there was a vacuum of leadership during the COVID pandemic?
The irony is that there were too many people trying to do that, and what I would say is that what you need is really clear lines of accountability, and we didn't always have that. And we had it much better after Cummings left. So when Cummings left, the formal lines of accountability of normal cabinet government were reasserted, and it made running government much, much easier. Now, on leadership more broadly, Boris is obviously a highly controversial figure, unlike me. Boris is, whatever, he is totally extraordinary as an individual, and he has bigger strengths and weaknesses than anybody I know. He has this ability to spot what are the really big questions and focus on them, and then, how should I put it, he's at his best when he delegates on the execution, and so he provided very, very significant national leadership in his way.
But isn't it a fundamental flaw that you say worked much better after Dominic Cummings left? And you say in your book, in relation to Dominic Cummings, you say, I find it so astonishing that Boris gives so much power to someone with such a blatant disregard for his, as in Boris's own agenda or instructions. There's no way any previous PM I've worked for would let it happen.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. It's absolutely, it's nuts. Yeah, it was nuts. It was absolutely ridiculous. And he'd come into he wouldn't physically come in, but he'd go to people in the department at sort of the wrong people and scare the bejesus out of them into doing something for him. And you've got to remember, we'd just come out of a period in which he had effectively ended the careers of a huge swathe of the Conservative Party, especially my bit of the Conservative Party, the liberal, moderate, progressive centre of the Conservative Party. And even during the early stages of the pandemic in February 2020, he effectively ended the career of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Mm-hmm. So this guy was incredibly powerful, and he was prepared not just to get rid of ministers, but also officials, right? And he was absolutely clear that he wanted to fire half of Whitehall. And then he would go to people and say, what are you doing about this? And they, instead of replying and saying, well, actually, my responsibility is slightly different, and the person you need to be talking to is that person, and we have lines of accountability that run up to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State then reports to the Prime Minister through the Cabinet Office protocol. They didn't reply that at all. They replied, I'm on it, and let me do what I can. And all of us felt that. And the role of leadership in a pandemic has to involve trying to bring people with you, and the job is to try to set the direction and say this is where we're going, and then provide the resources for everybody to do their best. And you have to be hugely trusting, because there was so much to do that you could not have a command and control approach to it. You had to essentially, and this is actually true of the NHS as a whole because of the dispersed nature of power within the NHS, you cannot run the NHS through command and control. You have to run the NHS through system leadership. That is to say, and this is true of large organisations, especially ones full of very bright people, dare I say it, Mishcon, and it's very nice to see the senior partner here. The way that you run large organisations that are full of brilliant people is you say, this is where we're going, let's all get behind this mission. You don't say, you do this, you do the other. And then we had this free agent in number 10 who people were petrified of, telling everybody to do other stuff. It was nuts.
So that free agent, Dominic Cummings, in a select committee hearing, was heavily critical of you. It can't have made for comfortable viewing. He said he thinks that you should have been fired on 15, 20 occasions. Was this?
Yeah, I think he said 40 later, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Was this book a way of settling scores? And do you think that his involvement led to failures in the COVID response?
Oh, there's absolutely no doubt. The book is about telling the truth. It isn't about settling scores. But I am pretty harsh about Cummings because that was my observation at the time. I think he was particularly aggressive against me in that select committee for tactical reasons. He admitted many things that he got wrong, and he didn't want the headlines to be about what he got wrong, and so he chose to be extremely aggressive about somebody. Mm-hmm. It's called a dead cat strategy. It's absolute classic, and it was obvious to me what he was doing at the time. Mm-hmm. It was obviously frustrating. I didn't know at the time that he was trying to get me fired. I knew he was being difficult, but he obviously was. Including telling Boris a load of stuff that wasn't true in order to get. Honestly, you asked two parts to your question. That was the answer to the first one. Is it settling scores?
Do you think he's responsible for failures?
Oh yeah. So it's obvious, right? Look at the difference in performance between the testing program and the vaccine program. He was heavily involved in the testing program from about May 2020 through to his resignation. And indeed, when he resigned, he said, "I'm now going to spend the next month on the testing program." I was like, "No, he's bloody not," and he didn't. That program was very difficult to run because of the long screwdriver, the attempt at which essentially it was about undermining lines of accountability. The vaccine program we kept out of number 10. Elements of it were run from the business department. The rollout was run from the NHS. The whole thing stayed out of number 10, and it was one of the most efficient government programs in history.
I think, we're all very grateful to have been vaccinated, but I think
And how long did you wait? Who waited more than 10 minutes? Good data architecture, no involvement of Dominic Cummings. Two mainstays.
I think you mentioned that one of your favourite chapters in the book is the epilogue 10 lessons learned, and you also say that you feel incredibly strongly and passionately about the rule of law. So I want to talk more about that.
Yeah.
In one of the lessons to be learned, you say that we should trust the public. And I think this is linked to what you say were delays in going down into the first lockdown because people thought that the public wouldn't comply with such draconian measures for a long period of time, and they did. But to trust the public and that they will comply with draconian measures, the public has to have trust in the politicians telling them to do so.
Yeah.
Now, over this period, we've seen quite a few attacks on the rule of law. We've seen issues such as Partygate, Owen Paterson, your own resignation, recent events such as BBC chairman loaning money to Boris while he was going through his selection. Do you think that these issues have damaged the public's trust in politicians, and do you think that that will affect the response to any future pandemic?
Well, I would take issue with some parts of the question. Okay. So set aside, I mean, on my resignation, my response would be I resigned, and that is accountability. You just said on the chairman of the BBC loaned money to Boris. That's not true.
Oh, so facilitated a loan.
No, he put people in contact with each other and had no further involvement, as far as I know. It's not something I'm very close to, but I think you've just got to be careful with the accusations, so as not to come over as partisan.
Just for the record, we're not partisan. As a firm, we're politically neutral. Just want to make that clear.
Yeah, no, of course. I'm just saying that.
No, absolutely. You've got to be, as you said from the start, we've got to be careful with
so
our
I don't
language.
understand the link from the defence of the rule of law, which I feel very strongly about, to those things. Patterson, for instance, he ended up having to stand down as an MP. So there was accountability there.
Rule of law isn't the same as accountability. Rule of law is abiding by the laws and the guidance. So if we take Partygate, the serving Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, they were found to have breached the law and they were issued with fines.
Yeah, I wasn't invited to any of these parties. I'm quite glad I wasn't invited to any of these parties.
But I think it's important, as you say, to be careful with
language. The irony of all of this is that I wasn't invited to parties, and I banned alcohol in the department because I didn't want people, working late to then have a few beers and that and end up being more social than they should. Look, I do think it is a challenge, right? Look at anti-vaxxers now, right? Anti-vaxxers were in abeyance before the pandemic, thank goodness. The rationalists had essentially won the argument over MMR. Mm-hmm. Andrew, Wakefield, had moved to the States. There was no purchase in the debate. In the last couple of months, that debate here has got more alive, and I regret that very deeply. So I think that there are. I think the longer these things go on, the harder it is to keep the public with you, and I do think it will be a challenge. However, my central point still stands, and I think it would stand if there were, God forbid, a new disease identified tomorrow, or bird flu makes a leap from other mammals to humans. I do think that if you give the public a clear explanation of what's needed and a clear reasoning for why, and try to communicate that in an emotionally intelligent way at a level that they get, which was what we tried to do from the podium, right? It was not technical epidemiology, it was epidemiology as explained. I always thought of my dad sitting next to or my granddad sitting next to the camera, as if I was talking to them. Intelligent lay people, non-expert. And don't patronise the public, then they will do what is necessary. And I think that would happen again. But I just hope that we don't have to do it for a very long time.
Us too.
I say we, I hope I don't have to do it ever again, but and I doubt I will.
So one of the effects, and that people have linked the COVID pandemic to the current NHS crisis, but it's clearly not the only reason why there are issues with the NHS.
Yeah.
The Health Foundation has stated that the pressures on the NHS result from a decade of underinvestment in the NHS and other public services, a failure to address chronic staff shortages, raiding capital budgets, and the long-standing neglect of adult social care. Now, you've been involved in frontline politics for over 12 years. You were the Chief of Staff to George Osborne when austerity policies were being discussed.
Yeah.
And you served under Cameron and then Theresa May. Do you accept that the NHS is in crisis? And how do you think the current Secretary of State should be dealing with the issue?
Yeah, so firstly, there was a successful effort to protect NHS budgets during the initial austerity under the coalition. And NHS budgets were one of the few areas that weren't cut when that government was trying to resolve the financial consequences of the crash in 2008. So again, I challenge some of the questioning. But what I'd say on the NHS and the future of the NHS is this, that there is a record number of clinicians, record number of doctors, record number of nurses, and yet record waiting times this winter. The absolute foundation of sorting out the NHS is making it better organised, and that comes down to data and the way that data is used in the NHS. There is no organisation in the world as large as the NHS, or even a tenth as large of it, that fails to use modern logistical capabilities that data and technology gives you to bring forward efficiency. And the lack of efficiency is about literally wasting huge amounts of time of highly valuable clinicians. So yes, I'm in favour of more, right? And more clinicians. In 2019, I was the guy who really fronted the 50,000 more nurses argument, and the government is on track to deliver that manifesto commitment. But what this winter has shown us is that is not on its own enough, and it can't be enough. And so there is a radical need. If you believe, like me, in an NHS free at the point of use, there is a radical, urgent need to bring it into the 21st century and make it better organised and waste less time for clinicians and patients alike. And in doing so, you have a far better data-driven ability to have a research agenda that will save future lives by finding new healthcare insights, so I think there is a solution out there. But I think that the political debate solution and the substantive solution are quite a long way apart. One of them essentially is highly technocratic, where the political debate is about ensuring that people who put too much emphasis on privacy and therefore become the reactionary small c conservatives, their arguments are respected but held in abeyance, whilst you actually use data like all modern organisations do. And that, for me, that I think, having run it for 3 years, I think that is the way that those who believe in the NHS can ensure it's sustainable for the long run.
Well, when you talk about the political argument and then the technical argument, it's interesting because the characters that you mention in your book, for instance, are the trying to build 40 new hospitals.
Yeah.
And you want to start with a hospital in Boris Johnson's constituency, and he's blowing hot and cold on it. And then he says, ask Rishi. And it seems that you're getting pushback from Steve Barclay, who was in the Treasury at the time, and Rishi, who was the Chancellor at the time. And now they're House Secretary and the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And so do you think that there is the political will in the Sunak administration to take those big decisions?
It's a great day to ask that question, because at Prime Minister's Questions today, Rishi, for the first time that I've seen it as Prime Minister, emphatically supported the 40 new hospitals. It's 40 new hospitals over this decade, so we're 3 years in? I think 8 are actually physically making progress. Out of the 40, and he recommitted to it. I wasn't in PMQs, I was in the office, and I gave a little hoop because that was my pledge, along with the 50,000 more nurses, and so that looks good. And
it's really interesting hearing your perspective, and you say that you don't think the austerity policies have affected or the cause of the crisis now. I think capital investment is different to what we pay our public sector workers, but we look at the strikes that are currently going on. I know the nurses have paused their strikes at the moment, but we have strikes from junior doctors, nurses, physios, ambulance workers. Would your stance on the strike action be different to the way the current government's dealing with it?
Well, what I recognise is this isn't a pivot. I will directly answer the question.
Okay. We'll wait.
What I recognise is essentially within any given budget, there is a tension between activity and pay. Mm-hmm. So the more you pay people, the fewer operations you can do. Okay. So that's for any given budget, because you can't spend budget twice. So that is the tension that Steve Barclay is feeling right now. Mm-hmm. He has a given budget, and he's like, I want to get through as much of the backlog as possible. That involves holding pay down. And that's just an honest trade-off that is reality. Mm-hmm. So I have sympathy with the desire to get through the backlog, and at the same time I think strikes are totally counterproductive, both for that goal and for the operation of the NHS as a whole. So I'd like that to be settled. So I was thrilled that it got called off. I had a really good relationship with the RCN during my time, and I don't think Donna Kinnair will thank me if I say how wonderful she was, because obviously, Tory health secretaries are supposed to have rows with the RCN, but we got on like a house on fire, and I always made sure that there was a really high quality dialogue, especially with the nurses, because the nurses really are the ones who run the NHS on the ground. I once said that, and the doctors were furious. They got
please everyone.
No, well.
I think on pleasing everyone, I think I want to turn to a more human story. And I know in your book it's quite clear that you're not a fan of Nicola Sturgeon. But when I was watching her resignation speech last week, and I think it really struck me that she was talking on a human level, that, one, that she was exhausted by the role of being a public servant in today's world, but also that she felt that she'd become a divisive figure, and that even on issues that were not controversial, when she attached her own support, it became toxic.
Yeah. Do
you feel, not that you became a divisive figure, but that there was a narrative that was built up around you?
Yeah. I think it's a really good question. I also saw her resignation speech, and the bit that I agreed with was the bit where she said, I think it's become more difficult. There is a problem in our public discourse. There is an acidity to our public discourse, worse than when I entered public life over a decade ago. Mm-hmm. It is harder to be a public figure because there is more vitriol pointed at everybody, and it is harder to get to rational, empirical policy conclusions. I'm an Enlightenment empiricist at heart, and what were eddies of sort of nutty conspiracy, those eddies are now taking up more and more of the river of public policy. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense, and that is a serious problem, and there is less overlap in the middle. And so I thought it was wonderful that William Hague and Tony Blair did a joint article this morning on the importance of science, because where is our prosperity going to come from over the next 50 years if it doesn't come from innovation and science ultimately, and then the use of that, putting that to use for the benefits of humanity, and that just gets harder. And so I, of course, at a human level, I absolutely sympathised with what Nicola Sturgeon said, and I think that it's a problem that we've all got to be cognizant of. So there's no easy answer to that one, though.
No.
Except TikTok. Everybody's lovely on TikTok. I don't know how many of you are on TikTok. It's great. Everyone's really positive. I mean, compared to Twitter.
I have heard you on TikTok. It makes me feel old, because I feel old if I go on TikTok.
You should follow me on TikTok. I was flipping a pancake yesterday. There's it's one of the things in the jungle. I came out of the jungle. I've got this large, unexpected following on TikTok.
Are you doing dances to Drake?
Hey?
You're doing dances to Drake and things like that?
That's a good idea. We should do that, yeah. No,
Write that down.
I'm getting a no. I do sort of comedy stuff well, I think it's quite funny, and then serious stuff as well, and it's very strange, social media. That's almost entirely positive. Few anti-vaxxers, but otherwise entirely positive. And then Twitter, you can't say anything without just totally negative, unpleasant vitriol. But then that feeds into the mainstream media, and there's a sort of feedback loop. So yes, gosh, I didn't expect to end this by saying I agree with Nicola Sturgeon, but I do.
And I think this is, we've had so much to cover, and we've got so many more questions, but I think this is a good point to turn to the questions that have been submitted in advance. And I think I want to just touch on what you've said in terms of the human level and the vitriol that you face. So normally at this stage, we open things up to the audience, but due to the high interest in this event, we've asked for questions to be submitted in advance. And you and your team have selected some of the questions that you feel comfortable answering, which are not necessarily, I'll be honest, the ones I would have chosen. And I think that's an interesting point because of the way that you have been treated. And I'm just interested, as a sitting MP who's gone on I'm a Celebrity, who's gone on SAS, Who Dares Wins, and who's written a book, what does that sensitivity come from in terms of answering questions?
It entirely comes from protecting my family. I mean, there's only so much that there's only so many times I can answer questions about my resignation that's fair on them, and there's no more.
So let's turn to the first question, which is from an external contact, Kate Bright, and she's asked, if you were able to wave a magic wand, how would UK businesses work more effectively with the government? Specifically, the best aligned strategies to amplify opportunities to trade overseas.
Right, crikey, that's a different subject.
Yeah. Pivot.
A pivot? No, the pivot's is not answering the question.
I'm new to this.
You can't pivot as a questioner.
Just reminds me of Friends. Is there anyone's Friends reference?
That's just, but it's definitely changing the subject. Anyway, God, I mean, where to start? I'll tell you what I really think in answer to this question, and that it has an impact on you as on the law as well, is one of the things that we have not yet done nearly enough is made sure that our regulatory regime across the board for business is optimised and efficient for the 21st century, protecting those things we hold dear whilst making it easy to abide by them. Brexit should be an opportunity for that. I voted Remain, but Christ, you've got to look for the opportunities that Brexit gives, and it does give those opportunities and a strengthening of a common law system as opposed to a clash of a common law and Napoleonic system. And we could get that much better. And for me, that is a major benefit of Brexit that we are in the foothills of exploiting.
And another question from Divya. How did you hope your appearance on I'm a Celebrity would change public perception of you? And how successful do you think your appearance has been in achieving this aim?
Good question. If it's judged by what happens when I walk down the street, it's been a real success. It's been very positive, very pleasant experience.
And on TikTok.
And this TikTok following. The reason I did it is because when you have a big entrenched personality in the public domain, not my personality is big and entrenched, that people's view of me is entrenched and widespread. There are few things in British public life big enough to actually try to show who you are as a person. And people had a particular view of me, and parts of it were accurate and parts of it were inaccurate. And basically views of me go all the way from total love and adulation to the exact opposite, right? And the challenge, the biggest challenge is that I was in charge of the health sphere in a time that was extremely serious. It would have been totally inappropriate to get any lightness or cheerfulness over because of the subject matter. And then because of everything that happened, everybody has a view. And I'm a Celeb is basically the only thing that can really shift that. And it's definitely shifted it. It hasn't completely, it hasn't changed everybody's minds, but I get loads of people saying, oh, I've changed my mind on you. That happens to me a lot.
Really?
Yeah, and I'm like, well, I was just a decent guy beforehand, and I'm just the same person. Well, I've just been through the ringer in the middle. But obviously, people saw me at the podium, and then they saw, the whole thing. And there's a group of people who, there's a group of people who blame me for what they should be blaming, in my view, definitely should be blaming the virus for. But that's human, right? I was the face of the thing, and so that's life.
And then I think just a last question to end on. This is from Jamie, and we started with Contagion. We'll finish with fiction. If you could play someone, living or dead, if you could pick someone, living or dead, to play you in a movie of the pandemic, who would it be?
When Sky did their series on the pandemic in the autumn, I was played by an actor who is considerably better looking than me. And when the team brought in the photograph of the guy who was going to play me, I thought that's a compliment. That's a pivot, that is.
Okay, well,
the answer is I haven't got any idea. I mean, who do you want to play me? That's another pivot.
I think that is a good place to end. Well, Matt, thank you so much for coming in.
You didn't answer the question.
That is my right. I'm not being interviewed. Thank you so much for coming in. I think it's been a fascinating talk, and we've covered a huge amount, and there's so much more that we could cover. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
The Mishcon Academy Digital Sessions. To access advice for businesses that is regularly updated, please visit mishcon.com.